What would you do if the only chance to save your family's future ended with a single, impulsive slap? Claire Hargrove was 36, exhausted, and desperate to pay for her mother's care. On a stormy day in Manhattan, she walked into a skyscraper for a secretary interview and walked out as the woman who struck a millionaire CEO across the face. But that slap was only the beginning. Behind it lay boardrooms where legacies were at stake, storms that tore apart entire towns, and a clash between numbers and humanity. Could a woman from Queens, weighed down by bills and quiet courage, change the course of a global empire? And could a grieving CEO, armored in discipline and loss, learn to see not just profit margins, but people? This is not a story of fairy tale romance. It is a story of dignity, resilience, and the promise that even in a world driven by wealth, humanity can still win. If this journey moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Let's begin. The rain had not let up since dawn. It came down in long silver threads that turned the streets of Midtown Manhattan into rivers of reflection, where headlights shimmered like restless fireflies. Claire Hargrove pulled her thrift store coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried toward the tower that seemed to pierce the low clouds. The Holloway Hospitality Group headquarters rose 50 stories above her, a monument to luxury she had only glimpsed from the sidewalk before. Today, she carried her resume in a folder, already damp at the edges, and she told herself, this interview could keep Mom in the nursing home another month. Don't fail. Her shoes squeaked against the marble as she stepped inside the lobby. The glass walls stretched high, swallowing the daylight. Security guards stood like statues, and a receptionist in a sleek black suit gave her a smile that never touched her eyes. Claire announced her name, her voice careful, polite, almost deferential. She was guided to a row of chrome chairs where other candidates had once surely sat, waiting for their chance. Minutes slipped into an hour. She kept glancing at the clock above the elevator bank, each second eating away at her confidence. No one offered her water. No one spoke her name again. She could see her reflection in the polished floor, damp hair curling, cheeks pale with nerves. She tried to imagine her mother's face, tried to think of her neighbor Nora's steady voice reminding her, "You are stronger than you think." At last, an assistant appeared. She was young, brisk, tapping a tablet as if every gesture was timed. "Follow me." Claire rose, clutching her folder. Her legs ached from the weight, but she walked quickly, refusing to appear weak. They entered an elevator that glided upward with a hush. When the doors opened, Claire stepped onto a carpet so thick it swallowed sound. The assistant led her down a hall lined with framed photographs of Holloway resorts, beaches in Greece, chalets in the Alps, city skylines lit like jewels. All of it felt impossibly far from Claire's own life, of bus rides and secondhand coats. Then, the assistant stopped at a set of double-glass doors. She opened them without knocking. Inside, the office was enormous, with windows stretching across the skyline, and there, behind a desk of dark wood, stood Grant Holloway. Claire had seen his picture in the news. In person, he looked taller, broader, the kind of man who filled a room without moving. His suit was tailored in shades of midnight, his hair touched with gray at the temples. His eyes were a stormy blue that seemed to measure her before she spoke a word. "You're late," he said flatly. Claire's throat tightened. I arrived on time. I was waiting." He cut her off with a flick of his hand. "If you had real initiative, you would have made sure I noticed you sooner. Sit." The assistant slipped away, leaving the two of them in silence. Claire sat, forcing her knees not to tremble. She laid her folder on the desk. Grant did not open it. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze sharp. "Why should I waste my time on a secretary who spent years waiting tables in Queens? Do you think answering phones here is the same as balancing plates of burgers?" Heat flooded her cheeks. She had scrubbed tables, yes, and folded napkins until her hands cracked, all while saving every dollar for her mother's care. But hearing it spoken with such disdain cut deep. She swallowed hard. "I know how to deal with people, how to listen, how to solve problems. Anyone can claim that. He leaned forward. What you don't have is pedigree. No Ivy League degree, no family connections, not even the right image. His eyes swept over her coat, her worn shoes. Do you think this company is a charity? Each word landed like a stone. Claire's chest tightened. She remembered her mother's voice in the nursing home, fragile, asking when Claire could visit again. She remembered the bills stacked on her kitchen counter, the calls from debt collectors. She had come here believing she might prove herself. Instead, she was being stripped bare by a man who seemed to take pleasure in her vulnerability. Something inside her snapped. She rose from the chair, her pulse hammering in her ears. "You don't know me," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't know what I've carried to be here." Grant smirked, a cold curve of lips. "What you've carried is irrelevant. What matters is whether you can serve me without faltering." The words sliced deeper than he intended. Claire's hand lifted before she could stop it. The crack of skin against skin echoed through the glass and steel office. Grant's head jerked to the side. Silence swallowed the room. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Claire's palm stung. Her breath came shallow. She saw the shock in his eyes, not pain, but disbelief that anyone dared to strike him. The doors burst open. Security guards rushed in, their radios crackling. "Mr. Holloway." Grant raised a hand, still staring at her. "Escort her out." They didn't need to be told twice. One guard gestured, the other reached lightly for her arm. Claire pulled free, her pride the only thing holding her upright. She marched past them, down the long hallway, past the glossy photographs of places she would never afford to see. The elevator carried her down, its mirrored walls reflecting her pale face, her damp hair, the fierce, frightened woman she barely recognized. When the lobby doors opened, the sound of rain rushed in. She stepped out into the storm, her shoes slipping on the wet sidewalk. She felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes. The city lights blurred through the downpour. She lifted her face to the rain, letting it wash away the heat of shame. Her hands still throbbed from the slap. With every step, the certainty grew she had just destroyed her only chance at saving her mother's future. Claire pulled her coat tighter, blending into the anonymous crowd, the tower shrinking behind her as if closing its doors forever. But fate, she would soon discover, had other plans. The subway rattled beneath Queens as Claire climbed the narrow stairwell to her building. Her clothes were damp again, not from rain this time, but from the sweat of carrying the day's humiliation on her shoulders. She pushed open the door to her apartment and felt the familiar chill inside. The radiator had long since given up fighting the spring dampness, and the faint drip from the ceiling marked where the roof had started to fail. She set her bag down and kicked off her shoes. The thin carpet was worn, the color faded to something between brown and gray. On the table near the door sat a pile of unopened envelopes. She didn't need to read the return addresses, the nursing home, the pharmacy, the electric company, all of them waiting to be paid. She poured the stack into her hands. The weight felt heavier than paper should. For a moment she leaned her head against the wall, her eyes closed, and let the silence swallow her. Then she moved to the kitchen, which was hardly more than a narrow strip of counter, and opened the tin where she kept coins. She tipped them out, lining them up in careful rose quarters, dimes, nickels. She had always done this since her Pennsylvania childhood, when her father's factory job ended and her mother had taught her to stretch every cent. From the shelf above the sink, she pulled down a notebook. The cover was creased, the pages filled with lists, groceries, bus fare, medication. She sharpened a pencil and began to calculate. Every line carried weight: rent, nursing home, food, subway passes. She paused when she reached the line for her mother's care. The number had gone up again last month. She tapped the pencil against the margin, trying to find where to cut. There was nothing left to cut. Her eyes blurred. She rubbed them quickly, not wanting to surrender to tears. She turned the page, hoping she had miscalculated earlier in the week, but the math came out the same. She had overestimated what remained in her checking account. There was no way to cover everything this month. The truth sank in, cold and heavy. She would have to choose which bill not to pay, and whichever she delayed, something vital would be lost. A knock came at the door, sharp but friendly. "Claire, you in there?" She opened it to find Nora Finch, her neighbor from across the hall. Nora still wore her nursing scrubs, the fabric carrying the faint smell of disinfectant. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back, and her kind eyes studied Claire's face. "You look like you've been through a storm," Nora said. Claire managed a smile that fooled no one. "Something like that?" Nora stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She placed a bag of groceries on the counter. Work had leftovers again. "Thought you could use some?" Claire wanted to refuse, but the sight of fresh bread and apples made her throat ache with gratitude. She busied herself putting them away, hiding the notebook under a magazine. Nora glanced toward the pile of envelopes. "Bills?" Claire nodded. "They don't stop coming." "They never do." Nora touched her arm. "But neither do we." The words steadied her. If only for a moment. When Nora left, Claire returned to the table and looked at her notes again. She could almost hear her mother's voice, gentle even in confusion. "Don't forget to eat, sweetheart. Don't forget yourself." But Claire knew there was no room for herself in this equation. She leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The drip had left a new stain, the shape of a dark spreading cloud. It mirrored the one inside her. Across the city, in a very different home, Grant Holloway sat in silence as well. His apartment overlooked the East River, but the view felt more like a cage than a privilege. He poured a glass of bourbon he barely tasted. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of his late wife, smiling in the sunlight of a Maine beach. That same sea had stolen her from him one reckless afternoon, leaving him with a daughter who rarely met his eyes and a company that demanded his constant devotion. His mother, Margaret, had urged him to soften, to remember that hospitality meant more than balance sheets. But grief had made him rigid, his life measured in profit margins and occupancy rates. Feelings were inefficiencies he could not afford. Down the hall, Lily's bedroom light glowed under the door. 14, sharp-eyed, already weary of the world. He heard the faint sound of music through the wall, the steady rhythm of someone trying to drown out silence. Grant lifted the glass again. The sting of the slap still burned on his cheek, though the skin had long cooled. He told himself it didn't matter. She was gone, dismissed. Yet the memory intruded anyway, the fire in her eyes, the way her voice shook but did not break when she said he didn't know her. He pushed the thought aside, burying it under numbers. Back in Queens, Claire folded the envelopes into a neat stack and placed them beside her bed. The night had deepened. She lay down, pulling the thin blanket over herself, but sleep would not come. Her hand drifted to her face, then to her palm, still sore from the strike she had delivered. The image replayed in her mind, again and again, the disbelief in his eyes, the echo of the sound. She had acted without control, and now she would pay for it. As the city hummed outside her window, Claire whispered a silent prayer that tomorrow would bring a way forward. She had no idea that tomorrow already carried its own answer. The afternoon light had begun to fade when a sharp knock rattled Claire's door. She startled, nearly spilling the cup of lukewarm tea she had been holding. For a second, she considered ignoring it. Most people who knocked at her door came with bills or demands she couldn't meet. The knocking came again, firmer this time. She opened the door to find a mail carrier in a blue jacket, holding out a thick envelope. "Delivery for Ms. Hargrove," he said. Claire signed her name with a shaky hand and closed the door. She turned the envelope over in her fingers. It was heavy, the paper smooth like satin, the edges trimmed with gold. In her small, cluttered kitchen, it looked absurd, like a jewel dropped into a pile of pebbles. Her stomach clenched. She thought of the slap, the humiliation, the way she had stormed out of that glass tower. This had to be legal action, a summons. A notice that Holloway Hospitality intended to crush her for daring to touch their CEO. She carried the envelope to the table and set it down. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She stared at the elegant seal embossed into the flap. It gleamed under the dim kitchen light. She tried to breathe, but her chest was tight. For several minutes, she couldn't bring herself to open it. Instead, she paced the small apartment, her bare feet making soft sounds on the worn linoleum. She glanced at the clock. She imagined lawyers in suits, already drawing up documents that would strip her of everything. Finally, with a whisper of torn paper, she slid a finger beneath the seal. The flap gave way, and she drew out a folded letter written on cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was precise, flowing. At the bottom was a signature in deep blue ink, Margaret Holloway. Claire's heart stumbled. Not a lawyer, not a court, Margaret, the matriarch. She sat down quickly, as if her knees might give out. She read the first lines. Ms. Hargrove, I would be honored if you would join me for dinner at my home on the Upper East Side. The words blurred as her mind raced. Dinner with Margaret Holloway. Why to scold her, to demand an apology, or perhaps to dismiss her face to face? In the quiet dignity of an oak-paneled dining room, her cheeks burned with shame at the memory of her hand striking Grant's cheek. She wanted to crawl under the floor and hide, and yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred. If Margaret truly wished to destroy her, why invite her with such courtesy? She read the letter again, this time slower. The sentences carried a weight that was not hostile. Formal, yes, but not cold. There was even a faint warmth between the lines, an acknowledgement that Claire's presence was desired, not merely tolerated. Still, her self-doubt screamed, "They're setting you up. They'll humiliate you again. Don't go." A knock came at the door again. Lighter this time. It was Nora, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She stepped inside without waiting for permission, as always, and saw the envelope on the table. "What's that?" she asked. Claire handed it to her silently. Nora read quickly, her eyebrows rising. Dinner with Margaret Holloway. Claire pressed her hands to her face. I made a fool of myself already. I can't sit across a table from her." Nora set the letter down. "Listen, honey, maybe this is her way of saying she sees something in you. At the very least. You go, you apologize. You show them you're more than one bad moment. What's the worst that can happen?" Claire gave her a look. "They could firebomb my dignity." "That's what?" Nora chuckled softly. "You think you still have dignity left after what happened? Then you've already won." The humor eased Claire's chest, if only a little. She picked up the letter again. Her name was written carefully. Every letter neat. It was the first time in days she felt truly seen. That night, long after Nora had gone, Claire sat at the table with the letter in front of her. She traced the embossed crest with her fingertip. She thought of her mother, lost in a haze of illness, and wondered if she would understand why her daughter felt both fear and hope. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on her nightstand. Then she reached for her phone and set the alarm for dawn. Tomorrow, she would go. The taxi rolled to a stop on a quiet street of the Upper East Side. The brownstones lined the block like guardians of an older New York, their stone facades softened by ivy and iron railings polished by decades of use. Claire paid the driver with crumpled bills, then stood on the sidewalk staring at the steps before her. Her hands were damp despite the cool evening. She climbed slowly, her heels clicking against the stone. When she pressed the brass bell, the sound echoed faintly inside. The door opened to reveal a man in a dark suit who inclined his head. "Ms. Hargrove, please, come in." The moment she crossed the threshold, the scent struck her aged oak and polish, mingled with something warmer, like vanilla and spice. The hall stretched ahead, lined with framed photographs. Generations of Holloways smiled from behind glass weddings, christenings, ribbon cuttings at hotels across the world. Each frame whispered of history, of wealth that built legacies. Claire felt like an intruder. The butler guided her into a parlor where a fire crackled gently in the hearth. Margaret Holloway rose from an armchair. She was tall, elegant, her silver hair swept back, her eyes bright with intelligence. She extended her hand with a warmth that startled Claire. "Ms. Hargrove, thank you for coming." Claire shook her hand, expecting frost, but the older woman's grip was firm and steady. They moved to a dining room where the table gleamed with crystal and china. A single setting was laid for each of them, close enough to encourage conversation rather than formality. Candles burned in silver holders, their light softening the corners of the room. For a moment, silence stretched. Claire fumbled with her napkin, waiting for reprimand, for the inevitable reminder of her mistake. But Margaret's voice was gentle. "You had quite a day with my son." Heat rushed to Claire's face. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Margaret lifted a hand. "No need. What matters is not the slap. What matters is what it revealed." Claire blinked. Revealed, Margaret studied her. Passion, courage, perhaps recklessness too. But this company was built on people who dared to act. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. The words settled over Claire like unexpected warmth. She tried to steady herself. "Why am I here? Because I believe you may help restore what has been lost." Margaret leaned forward slightly. Hospitality, at its heart, is not marble lobbies or profit margins. It is dignity, kindness, the art of making someone feel they belong. Holloway hospitality has grown vast, but in that growth, it has become hollow. Claire absorbed the phrase, hollow. It carried a truth she had sensed in Grant's office, in the way the company treated her as nothing more than a file. Margaret continued, "I want to test a new approach, human-first hospitality. You would serve directly under me, not as a secretary, but as a special aide, guiding a pilot program that puts people before numbers. It will not be easy. My son will resist. The board will resist. They believe efficiency is everything, but efficiency without humanity destroys what made us great." Claire's chest tightened. It sounded impossible. She was nobody, a woman from Queens who counted coins at night. How could she step into a world of crystal and oak? Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. "I am not offering charity. I am offering challenge. You will be judged, questioned, perhaps even undermined, but you may also find a place where your voice matters." Dinner passed with quiet conversation. Margaret asked about Claire's upbringing, her mother's illness, her work in small hotels. There was no pity in her questions, only attentiveness, as if each detail painted a picture she wished to understand. Claire found herself speaking more openly than she expected, her words spilling into the candlelit air. After the plates were cleared, Margaret invited her to walk through the hall once more. They paused before a large portrait. Claire recognized the man, at once Grant, years younger, smiling with a woman beside him. The woman's eyes sparkled, her arm entwined with his. "My daughter-in-law," Margaret said softly. "Anna, we lost her to the sea." Claire felt the weight of grief that lingered in the house. The smile in the portrait seemed alive, yet the silence around it spoke of absence that could never be filled. She thought of Grant's sharp words, his walls of data and control. Now she understood the wound behind them. Margaret touched Claire's arm. "This family has known loss, but we cannot let grief dictate the future. Grant has closed himself off. Perhaps you can show him another way. Or perhaps not. But I believe you can try." Claire stared at the portrait, the painted waves in the background, the joy frozen forever. Her heart ached with empathy. When she turned back, Margaret's gaze was steady. "Will you accept?" The silence stretched. Claire thought of the bills waiting at home, of her mother's fragile smile, of the shame that had followed her since that slap. She thought of how small her world had been, and how, for the first time, a door was opening into something larger. Her voice trembled, but she nodded. Yes, Margaret smiled, a slow curve that held both relief and anticipation. As Claire left the brownstone that night, the city lights glimmered on the wet pavement. Her steps were heavy, but not with defeat, with weight, with responsibility. She pulled her coat tighter, her mind racing with fear and fragile hope. Tomorrow, everything would change again. The text alert came just after dawn. Claire's phone buzzed on the nightstand, its shrill tone slicing through the fragile sleep she had managed. She reached for it, squinting at the screen, a coastal storm warning. Then another message followed from Holloway headquarters, marked urgent. By the time she turned on the television, the news was already showing it images of Holloway's historic seaside hotel in Maine, its tall white columns battered by rain, waves crashing against the seawall. The reporter's voice was almost lost to the howl of the wind. Authorities are urging residents to seek shelter. Power outages are spreading across the county. Emergency crews are struggling to reach the area. Her heart thudded. The Holloway name was everywhere, scrolling headlines. Photos of frightened guests huddling in the lobby. This wasn't a simple storm. This was a public disaster. A black sedan arrived within the hour. Margaret's driver held the door as Claire climbed in. Inside, Grant sat with his laptop open, eyes fixed on numbers that changed in real time. Revenue losses, booking cancellations, insurance figures. He barely glanced up when she entered. "We're flying to Maine," he said. "The board wants a damage assessment by nightfall." The jet was waiting at Teterboro. As they lifted into the gray sky, Claire looked down at the city dissolving into mist. Grant typed furiously, speaking into his phone, issuing clipped commands to managers already on site. His focus was relentless. Every sentence about cost, liability, and the company's reputation. Claire folded her hands in her lap, trying to steady herself. She had never flown private before. The leather seat smelled of polish, the cabin quiet except for the drone of engines and the scratch of Grant's pen. She thought of the guests in the hotel, children clinging to parents, staff working through the night. They weren't numbers. They were faces. When they landed, the storm had only grown worse. Rain lashed sideways, stinging her cheeks as she followed Grant toward a waiting SUV. The drive to the hotel was slow, roads flooded, trees bending under the wind. The Holloway Grand stood like a weary sentinel at the edge of the sea, its paint peeled under the downpour, windows rattling in the gusts. Inside, the lobby was packed. Families sat on suitcases, volunteers handing out bottled water. Staff in soaked uniforms hurried between groups, their exhaustion plain. Grant strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. Managers rushed to him with tablets, listing room counts, damage reports, projected losses. He listened, nodding curtly, asking about insurance claims and refund percentages. Claire drifted toward a corner where a housekeeper sat, her hands shaking as she tried to wring out her apron. A man in his 60s pressed a towel against the child's forehead. The boy's lips were blue from cold. "Are you being taken care of?" Claire asked softly. The woman shook her head. "The generators are failing. Some of the rooms don't have heat." Claire looked up at the chandeliers, their lights flickering. Outside, thunder rolled like a warning. She crossed the lobby, searching for Grant. He was deep in conversation with the operations director, his tone brisk. "We can move unaffected guests to sister properties in Portland," he was saying. "File the claims immediately. We can't let this damage our quarterly reports." Claire stepped closer. "What about the people stuck here? Locals who lost their homes, rescue teams with no place to sleep?" Grant glanced at her, his patience thin. "We're running a hotel, Ms. Hargrove, not a shelter." Her stomach twisted. "Hospitality isn't only about profit. These people need us. Need doesn't pay the bills," he snapped. The words stung, but before she could answer, the lights went out. The lobby plunged into darkness, followed by the startled cries of children. The storm roared against the walls, louder now, merciless. Emergency lanterns flickered on, dim and unsteady. Guests clung to each other. A baby wailed. Staff tried to calm the crowd, their voices tight with fear. Claire's pulse raced. She could hear the sea pounding just beyond the walls, each wave threatening to break through. In the corner, a reporter's camera light clicked on, capturing every desperate face. This was no longer just a company crisis. It was a test of humanity. Grant barked orders to the managers, directing them to prioritize VIP guests to ensure the brand's reputation remained intact. But his words sounded hollow against the cries of the stranded. Claire stood frozen for a moment, caught between fear and the knowledge that doing nothing would cost more than money. She turned, scanning the crowded lobby. She saw the tired eyes of a firefighter, still in wet gear, the shivering shoulders of an elderly woman clutching her dog. She knew what had to be done, even if it defied every number on Grant's screen. Her hand tightened around the edge of the reception desk. A thought sparked. Dangerous, but necessary. What if we opened the hotel, not just for guests, but for all who needed shelter? The idea terrified her. It would challenge Grant, anger the board, perhaps end her role before it truly began. But as another crash of thunder shook the windows, she understood there was no other choice. The storm was raging outside, but the real battle was about to begin inside these walls. The lobby smelled of wet clothes and seawater. Rainwater dripped from the coats of the rescue team as they huddled in one corner, their boots leaving dark prints across the marble floor. They had been pulling families from flooded homes since dawn, and now, with the storm still raging, they had nowhere to go. Claire's eyes lingered on them. Their faces were drawn, their hands raw from ropes and cold water. One of them pulled off his helmet and let out a cough that rattled deep in his chest. They weren't guests. They had no reservations. And yet, they looked more desperate than anyone else in the room. She turned to Grant. He was bent over a clipboard, tallying room availability with the operations manager. His voice was firm, detached. We need to relocate paying guests to undamaged wings. That's the priority. Claire's frustration rose like the tide outside. What about them? She gestured to the soaked rescuers. They've been out there saving lives all night. They can't go back into the storm without rest. Grant barely looked up. They aren't our responsibility. Her chest tightened. She took a step closer, lowering her voice but not her urgency. Hospitality doesn't stop at the front desk. If we turn them away, the press will crucify us. But more than that, it's wrong. The words hung between them. For a long moment, Grant's jaw worked as if he were chewing on something bitter. Then, reluctantly, he gave a short nod. Fine. A limited block of rooms. Call it temporary relief. Claire seized the chance. She moved quickly, rallying staff to prepare rooms. Sheets were changed, towels warmed, trays of hot tea sent up. Within the hour, the rescuers were led upstairs. Their gratitude was quiet, tired, but it filled the hall like a blessing. Yet Claire knew it wasn't enough. The lobby still overflowed with locals who had lost their homes. A child whimpered against his mother's shoulder. An old man sat shivering with a blanket too thin to keep out the damp. She approached Grant again. He stood near the front desk, typing into his phone, his expression carved from stone. "We should open the kitchen," she said softly. He looked at her as if she had spoken in another language. "The kitchen. We're already stretched thin. We have food going to waste in storage," she pressed. "Let the chefs cook for everyone here. Make a community meal. People need warmth more than numbers right now." For a moment, she thought he would refuse. His eyes were hard, his shoulders rigid. Then the lights flickered again, drawing frightened gasps from the crowd. A reporter's camera swung toward them, recording every second. Grant exhaled, long and slow. "Do it, but keep it controlled." The kitchen roared to life. Pots clanged, ovens glowed, steam filled the air. The smell of soup drifted into the lobby, rich with herbs and broth. Volunteers carried trays between the stranded, handing out bowls and bread. Slowly, the tension eased. Conversation replaced silence. Laughter broke through in pockets. For the first time since the storm began, hope stirred. Claire watched it all, her heart swelling. This was hospitality, not marble columns or balance sheets, but the simple act of feeding the weary and sheltering the vulnerable. She turned and caught Grant watching too. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between reluctance and reluctant respect. Later, she found him standing near a window, staring into the darkness where the ocean raged. His hand rested against the glass as if he could feel the waves through it. "My wife loved this coast," he said quietly. Without turning, she believed the sea gave more than it took. Claire hesitated, sensing the fragility in his tone, and what do you believe his jaw tightened? That it only takes... The words were raw, stripped of the armor he usually wore. For the first time, she saw not just the CEO, but the man carrying a grief that had shaped every harsh edge. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face shuddering again. Headquarters. He read quickly, then slipped the phone into his pocket. They have a plan, bigger than this storm. Claire frowned. What kind of plan? But he didn't reply. His eyes returned to the waves, the reflection of the emergency lights flickering across his face. Claire stepped back, her mind still on the rescuers upstairs. The families fed in the lobby. Something had shifted between them tonight. Fragile but undeniable. Respect, maybe even trust. And yet, a shadow loomed in that unread message. The storm in Maine had quieted, but another kind of storm was brewing in New York. Claire sat at the far end of a long mahogany table in the Holloway boardroom. The room was paneled in dark wood, softened only by the glow of a chandelier overhead. Around her, members of the board adjusted their cufflinks and rustled papers, their faces sharp with calculation. She felt like an intruder in borrowed territory, yet Margaret had insisted she attend. At the head of the table, Margaret's voice carried the weight of decades. "We have a choice. We can continue to patch holes in our culture, or we can begin again, tonight. I propose a pilot program, human-first hospitality, and I propose London as our testing ground." Murmurs rose, quick and skeptical. London, a global city, a flagship property, the kind of move that could redefine the company or break it. Margaret lifted a sheet of paper. "I nominate Claire Hargrove to lead this initiative." The air shifted. Claire felt every eye turn to her. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her name spoken in this room was both honor and threat. Grant leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. His expression was controlled, but his eyes gave him away. Shock, resistance, and something colder, betrayal. One director cleared his throat. "With respect, Mrs. Holloway. This woman is untested, a newcomer. How can we trust her with an international property?" Margaret's reply was steady. "Because she remembers what we have forgotten. She sees people, not just figures. That storm in Maine could have destroyed us. Instead, it gave us credibility. The world saw Holloway Hospitality open its doors. That was her influence." Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to refuse, to explain she wasn't ready. But her voice stuck. She could only watch as the debate swirled around her. Some board members argued fiercely against the idea. Others softened as Margaret reminded them of dwindling guest satisfaction scores, of luxury competitors overtaking them in loyalty. Words like innovation and future were thrown across the table, but under them all ran the pulse of power. Grant's silence grew heavier. Finally, he spoke. "This is not a pilot. It is a gamble. And the stake is not just a building in London. It is the company's reputation. If she fails, we will not recover easily." His words cut deeper than the storm's wind ever had. Claire stared at him, her chest tight. He wasn't wrong. She was untested. But to hear him dismiss her so coldly after what they had endured together in Maine, after the fragile trust that had begun to form, left her hollow. Margaret looked directly at her. "Claire, do you accept?" The room waited. She could feel their eyes pressing down like weight on her shoulders. If she said yes, she might step into a world larger than she had ever imagined. If she said no, she might return to Queens, her mother's bills piling higher, her brief glimpse of change extinguished. Her mouth was dry, but she found her voice. Yes, the word echoed in her own ears, foreign and final. The meeting moved on, votes tallied, motions passed. Claire barely heard them. Her mind spun, images colliding her mother's fragile smile, the drenched rescuers in Maine, Grant's unreadable stare. When the session ended, the board members filed out with murmured farewells. Margaret lingered near the doorway, offering Claire a brief nod of approval before she, too, departed. That left Claire and Grant alone in the vast room. He stood slowly, gathering his papers with deliberate care. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at her, his voice low. "You just let her place you on the board's chessboard. Do you know what piece you are?" "Claire, you're not the queen, not even the rook. You're a pawn, and pawns get sacrificed." His words stung because they carried truth. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't know how to answer. He walked past her, the scent of his cologne sharp, his presence overwhelming even as he left. At the door, he paused, his voice quieter now. "London will test you, and it will test me. I hope you understand the cost." When the door shut, the silence pressed in. Claire sat again, her hands trembling against the polished wood of the table. She had agreed. She had stepped into their game. The victory of being chosen felt thin, already shadowed by the realization Margaret had set her against her own son. And Grant, with his grief and pride, would not forgive easily. Her phone buzzed. A message from Nora. How did it go? Claire stared at the screen, unable to type. Across the room, she imagined she could still feel Grant's gaze, cool and disappointed. It was not just a job offer. It was a wedge, driving deeper into a fracture she hadn't meant to cause. And yet, beneath the fear, a spark glowed, a chance, a door. But every door had a price. Back in New York, the rhythm of life became mechanical again. Meetings, schedules, reports. Claire noticed how quickly the warmth from Maine had faded into formality. She would see Grant across the long conference table, his posture impeccable, his eyes cool. Their exchanges were clipped, professional. His emails came as single lines, stripped of anything but command. Send figures, confirm by noon. Attend briefing at 3. It was as if the storm and the sheltering of strangers had never happened, as if the respect that had flickered between them had been erased. Claire told herself to focus. She had London ahead of her, a 6-month assignment that could change everything. But each day, the distance between them grew heavier. At home in Queens, she sat at the kitchen table late into the night, bills spread out like silent accusations. Her mother's care center had raised rates again. The new total circled in red ink stared back at her. She pressed her palms into her eyes, fighting the ache behind them. She was building a future in boardrooms while losing ground at home. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Nora. "How are you holding up?" Claire typed back slowly. "Like I'm trying to live 2 lives, and failing both." The next morning, she arrived at the office early, hoping to catch a moment of quiet. But Grant was already there, standing by the window with his phone. His reflection in the glass was sharp, his voice low. "I told you," he said into the phone. "We cannot afford sentiment. Not now." He ended the call and turned. His eyes met hers. And for a second, something softened. Then it was gone. "We need to review the London projections," he said. They sat together, side by side, but worlds apart. Claire pointed out the cultural differences, the need to adjust services for local expectations. Grant countered with cost analyses, occupancy forecasts, risk models. Each suggestion she made met with a wall of numbers. Finally, she snapped, "You're not listening. You're treating this like a ledger, not like people's lives." His jaw tightened. "And you're treating it like a charity, not a business. Do you think London is some experiment for your ideals? If you fail, you drag all of us down with you." Her chest burned. "I didn't ask for this role. Your mother put me here. But I'm trying. I'm trying because I believe this company can be more than profit sheets." Something in his eyes flickered anger or fear. His voice dropped, cold. Belief doesn't rebuild what you've lost. Numbers do. I learned that the hard way. Maybe you should too. The words hit harder than intended. Claire froze, her throat closing. He didn't need to say more. She understood. His wife, the sea, loss measured not in sentiment, but in the cruel arithmetic of survival. Still, the wound was open now. She pushed back her chair, the legs scraping against the polished floor. I'm not your wife, Grant, and I won't carry your grief like it's my fault. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. His face went pale, as if she had struck him again. Regret stabbed at her, but pride held her still. She gathered her papers, her hands trembling, and walked out. That night, she boarded the subway home. The train rattled through dark tunnels, its lights flickering against the tired faces of strangers. Claire sat with her head in her hands, the weight of her words pressing down. She had spoken truth, but also cruelty. She had wanted to reach him, to crack the wall he had built. Instead, she had driven the wedge deeper. The city blurred past the window. She felt caught between two worlds, the world of brownstones and boardrooms, and the world of queens and unpaid bills. She didn't belong fully in either. As the train screeched into another station, Claire closed her eyes. Her heart felt heavy, her body exhausted, her future uncertain. She had chosen to step into their game, but tonight she wondered if she had already lost. It began with a single video clip, shaky and grainy, posted on a late-night forum. Within hours, it had spread to every corner of social media. Claire sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, her hands frozen on the keyboard, on the screen. There she was, standing in Grant Holloway's office, her hand rising, the crack of the slap echoing through tinny speakers. Someone had added dramatic captions. The waitress who struck the king. She shut the laptop quickly, her stomach twisting. But it was too late. Her phone buzzed with notifications. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years sent links. Strangers tagged her name with insults. Headlines bloomed across news sites. Holloway hospitality scandal. CEO struck by candidate. Unprofessional or unheard. Hero. Her cheeks burned as she scrolled through comments. Some called her reckless, others worse. A few defended her, but their voices were drowned out by the noise. Her phone rang. It was Nora. Don't read it. Claire, don't give them that power. But Claire's voice shook. They're right. I lost control. And now, the whole world knows it. At Holloway headquarters, the board was in uproar. Claire walked into the marble lobby the next morning and felt eyes follow her, whispers trailing behind. The receptionist avoided her gaze. An executive brushed past her as if she were invisible. The meeting was swift and brutal. Several board members demanded her removal from the London project. She is a liability, one said flatly. We cannot risk our reputation on her shoulders. Claire sat stiff in her chair, heat prickling her skin. She wanted to argue, but every word felt like quicksand. She had no defense that would matter. The video spoke louder than anything she could say. Then the door opened. Grant walked in. The room quieted instantly. Cameras had caught him entering the building earlier, his face unreadable. Now, standing at the head of the table, he placed both hands firmly on the polished wood. The blame is not hers, he said. Claire's heart jolted. Grant's gaze swept across the board. That moment, the slap wasn't the problem. It was the symptom. A symptom of how far we've drifted from our purpose. She reacted not because she is reckless, but because we have become indifferent. Our processes strip people of dignity. Even in a job interview, we treat them as files, not as human beings. A murmur rippled through the room. He continued, his voice steady, deliberate. Claire Hargrove reminded us of what hospitality means. She may have struck me, but in truth, she struck the arrogance this company has allowed to grow. And for that, I am grateful. The silence was thick. Claire felt her breath catch, her defenses, the walls she had built after his coldness, wavered. She searched his face for mockery, for some hidden agenda, but his eyes held none. They were clear, earnest, and for the first time unshielded. The board could not ignore the public tide. Reporters were already outside, hungry for answers. And so, a press conference was called. Claire stood in the wings, trembling, as Grant faced the cameras. Flashbulbs burst like tiny storms. Microphones crowded the podium. "My name is Grant Holloway," he began, "and I want to speak about what happened in my office weeks ago." He paused, letting the murmurs fade. A video is circulating of Ms. Claire Hargrove striking me. The truth is, she did, and I deserved it. Gasps filled the room. Claire's knees weakened, Grant's tone deepened, because that slap wasn't about disrespect. It was about truth. Truth that I and this company had forgotten. We were measuring success in margins while ignoring the very people we serve. Claire reminded us that hospitality without humanity is nothing. She is not our liability. She is our conscience. The words struck harder than any slap. Cameras clicked furiously. Some reporters lowered their pens, stunned. Claire's chest ached, her eyes burned, though she fought the tears. To hear him speak not with numbers, not with armor, but with raw conviction, it broke something inside her. By the next morning, headlines shifted. Holloway CEO admits fault, slap scene as wake-up call, from scandal to symbol of change. Public opinion turned. The hate softened into debate, and the debate into admiration. Claire's name was no longer a punchline, but a banner. At her desk, she scrolled through the new articles, still disbelieving. A photograph showed Grant at the podium, eyes steady, shoulders squared. Another showed her in the background, blurred but present. Nora called again. This time her voice was bright. "Honey, he didn't just defend you. He lifted you. The world saw it." Claire closed her eyes, pressing the phone to her ear. Her heart raced with a confusing mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that he had spoken for her. Fear of what it meant that he had reached across the gulf between them, that he had touched the very place she had vowed to protect. That night, she lay awake in her small Queens apartment, staring at the ceiling. The noise of the city drifted through the thin windows. She thought of Grant's words, the way his voice had softened when he said she was their conscience. Something inside her shifted. The man she thought she knew, the cold executive, the wall of numbers, was not the only truth. There was another man, one who could stand before the world and bear himself, and that terrified her even more than his indifference had. The boardroom was quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Its hands moved with steady precision, marking time in a space where lives and futures shifted in silence. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, her presence commanding but calm. Before her lay a folder bound in dark leather. She opened it with deliberate care and spread the papers across the polished wood. "This," she said, her voice clear, "is not about replacing one vision with another. It is about balance. Two tracts, two forces, data and humanity working side by side." Claire sat straighter, her pulse quickening. She glanced at Grant. His jaw was tight, his hands folded neatly, but his eyes flicked to the documents with a wary intensity. Margaret continued, "We call it the dual-axis model. On one axis, efficiency, technology, the numbers that keep us solvent. On the other axis, the human-first principles we've neglected. Neither can stand alone, but together, they create stability and growth that honors both people and profit." Her words hung in the air. Claire felt the weight of them, heavy and yet promising. Margaret tapped one page. "I want both of you to lead it, jointly." Grant's head turned sharply. "Joint leadership." "Yes," her tone was firm. "You, with your discipline, your relentless pursuit of excellence. Claire, with your courage to see beyond numbers. The board will resist unless they see unity." This is not about one voice shouting down the other. It is about two voices proving we can move forward together. the silence stretched, Claire's thoughts tangled, led with Grant. After everything, after the words that had cut her in that conference room, after the way he had stood at a podium and surprised her with his defense, her chest ached with the conflict. But Margaret was right. Alone, neither of them could carry this. Margaret's gaze softened as she added, "There is one condition. We will establish a fund, the Heart of the Sea. It will support the communities along the Maine coast who still struggle after the storm. It will be the living proof that this company's soul has not died." Claire's throat tightened. The name alone stirred something deep. She pictured the weary faces in that lobby, the rescuers in soaked uniforms, the soup steaming in the cold. This was what she had wanted all along, not charity, but compassion woven into structure. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Grant's eyes snapped to her, searching. His lips parted, but no words came. The silence between them was not cold this time. It was thick with something unspoken respect, perhaps, or reluctant recognition. Finally, he exhaled. "If this fails, it will be on both of us." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "If it fails, it will be because one of you refused to trust the other, and I will not let that happen." The air in the room shifted. Claire felt her shoulders straighten. For once, she wasn't walking alone into an impossible task. She was walking beside someone, even if that someone still frightened her in ways she couldn't explain. Margaret gathered the papers and closed the folder with a decisive snap. "Prepare yourselves. The board will demand answers. Tomorrow, you will give them not just numbers, not just ideals, but a vision, a shared one." Claire left the room with her heart pounding. The hallway outside felt colder, the marble echoing beneath her heels. She thought of her mother's fragile smile, of Nora's steady voice, of the countless lives hidden behind spreadsheets. She thought, too, of Grant's face when he finally nodded, the flicker of something vulnerable behind his control. This was no longer about proving herself. It was about proving that two wounded people, bound by loss and circumstance, could create something larger than either had imagined. That night, Claire sat at her kitchen table in Queens with the draft proposal in front of her. She traced the name Heart of the Sea with her fingertip. The ink smudged faintly beneath her skin. Her phone buzzed, a message from Grant. "We meet at 8 a.m. to finalize. Don't be late." She stared at the screen, a smile tugging at her lips despite the sternness of the words. Something had shifted. They were not friends, not yet allies, but they were no longer enemies either. As she set her alarm for dawn, she whispered to herself, "This is bigger than me," and she believed it. Tomorrow, the board would decide. The boardroom on the 50th floor seemed to float above Manhattan. Walls of glass revealed the skyline stretching in every direction, steel and stone softened by the pale morning light. But inside, the air was heavy. Decisions made here would ripple far beyond the room. Claire stood at the end of the polished table, her palms pressed lightly against the wood. Beside her, Grant adjusted his tie, his expression a mask of calm. Across from them, the board members waited, pens poised, eyes skeptical. Margaret sat at the head, her presence silent but commanding. "We are here to decide the future of Holloway hospitality," she said. "Mr. Holloway, Ms. Hargrove, you may present." Claire swallowed hard. She had rehearsed, but the weight of so many eyes pressed down on her chest. Then she felt Grant's hand rest briefly against the table near hers. Not a touch, just a presence, steadying. She drew a breath. "We propose a dual-axis model," she began. Her voice was soft but clear. One axis is efficiency technology, data, financial discipline. The other is humanity care, dignity, and the stories that bind guests to us. Grant picked up seamlessly. The two are not enemies. Efficiency without humanity is sterile. Humanity without efficiency is unsustainable. Together, they create strength. The room shifted. Some brows furrowed, others lifted slightly. Claire opened a folder and laid out photographs and images of the Maine storm, the rescue workers housed in their rooms, the kitchen serving soup to stranded families. These were not line items, she said. They were lives. And when we opened our doors, the world noticed. Bookings rose, not because of discounts or ads, but because people saw who we were at our best. A director leaned back, arms crossed. Sentiment doesn't pay shareholders. Grant met his gaze evenly. It does. If you measure loyalty, reputation, and long-term growth, data shows customer retention improves when guests feel valued. That is what we failed to deliver. This model corrects it. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the final sheet. And we propose the Heart of the Sea Fund, a permanent commitment to communities like those in Maine, not charity, partnership. We thrive when they thrive. The words hung in the air, fragile yet firm. Silence followed. Then the questions began, projections, risks, governance. Claire answered steadily, speaking not as a candidate begging for a chance, but as a leader holding ground. Grant spoke with precision, balancing her warmth with his discipline. Slowly, the resistance softened. One board member nodded thoughtfully. Another scribbled notes, no longer frowning. Margaret watched, her eyes glinting with quiet pride. Finally, the chair of finance cleared his throat. Enough. Let us vote. A secretary distributed slips of paper. The scratching of pens was the loudest sound in the room. Claire's heart pounded, each tick of the clock stretching like a drumbeat. She glanced at Grant, but his face gave nothing away. The votes were collected, counted, and read aloud. On the motion of adopting the dual-axis model, approved. Claire exhaled shakily, her knees weak. On the matter of leadership, Grant Holloway retained as CEO. Grant's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. And on the matter of special appointment, Ms. Claire Hargrove confirmed as special executive lead for the Human First Tract, to commence with the London project. The words rang in her ears. Confirmed, not debated, not postponed. Confirmed. A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Some members looked resigned, others even approving. Margaret leaned back, her lips curving in a rare smile. Claire stood frozen. She felt the weight land on her shoulders, heavier than any she had carried before. Yet beneath it was a strange lightness, as if something inside her had been set free. Grant turned to her, his expression unreadable, but there was no dismissal in his eyes this time, only acknowledgement. As the board dispersed, Margaret rose. You both have much to prepare. London will be watching, and so will I. When the room emptied, Claire walked to the window. The city sprawled below, restless and alive. Her reflection in the glass startled her. A woman not of queens alone, not of kitchens with dripping ceilings, but of boardrooms 50 floors above the streets. Grant came to stand beside her. For a moment, they said nothing. Then he murmured, "This is only the beginning." She nodded, her heart steady. The burden was great, but for once she did not feel crushed beneath it. She felt ready. The sea was calm that night. Waves rose and fell in a steady rhythm, their sound carrying across the newly restored veranda of the Holloway Grand in Maine. Lanterns glowed along the railings, their light golden against the deepening blue. Guests gathered in the ballroom for the reopening ceremony. At the front row sat men and women in orange rescue jackets, their shoulders straight, their eyes reflecting pride and exhaustion remembered. They had been the first through the flood, the ones who had pulled strangers from rising waters. Tonight, they were honored guests. Claire stood near the stage, her heart swelling as applause rolled through the room. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing extravagant, but it felt right. She thought of the woman she had been months ago, the candidate clutching a folder in the rain, humiliated, uncertain. That woman still lived inside her, but tonight she stood taller. Margaret opened the ceremony, her voice rich and sure. We honor not only the rebuilding of a hotel, but the rebuilding of trust. Tonight we launch the Heart of the Sea Fund. It will remind us that hospitality begins not with numbers, but with people. The crowd clapped, some rising to their feet. Claire felt her eyes sting. Later, as music filled the room and guests mingled, she slipped outside. the cool salt air wrapped around her, carrying memories of storms past. She leaned against the railing, letting the sound of waves steady her. "Beautiful night," a voice said behind her. She turned. Grant stood there, dressed in a dark suit, his tie loosened. For once, his posture was relaxed, his face unguarded. He held a small velvet pouch in his hand. "This belonged to Anna," he said softly. "She wore it when we first opened this hotel." He drew out a silver pendant, its surface etched with tiny waves. "It should stay here, with someone who understands what this place means." Claire's breath caught. "Grant, He placed the pendant in her hand. "I'm not asking you to replace her. No one can. But I want you to carry it as a reminder of her, of the sea, of the promise that loss doesn't have the final word." Her fingers closed around the cool metal. She met his eyes, and for the first time, there was no wall, no battle, only a quiet understanding. Inside, music swelled. Margaret danced briefly with one of the rescuers, laughter spilling across the room. At a corner table, Lily sat with her grandmother, her eyes brighter than Claire had ever seen. She caught Claire's gaze and offered a shy wave. Claire returned it, her chest warm. When Grant spoke again, his voice was low, meant for her alone. "We'll never have the luxury of a simple life. Claire, there will be schedules, flights, meetings stacked on meetings, London, New York, Maine. It won't be easy." Claire smiled faintly. "I stopped looking for easy a long time ago." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Then maybe we can build something harder, something worth it." There was no dramatic gesture, no glittering ring, only two people, both scarred by the past, choosing to walk forward together. It was not romance written in fireworks. It was steadiness, commitment, the quiet courage to show up again and again. Later, they returned to the ballroom. Claire joined Grant on stage as Margaret announced the official launch of Human First Hospitality. Cameras flashed, applause thundered. And for a moment, Claire felt the floor steady beneath her feet in a way it never had before. When the ceremony ended, she stood by the door, thanking guests, shaking hands with neighbors and strangers alike. Each smile, each word of gratitude reminded her why she was here. This wasn't only a job, it was a calling. The night drew on, and the waves outside kept their rhythm. Claire slipped the silver pendant around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart. She thought of her mother, now receiving steady care. She thought of Nora back in Queens, cheering her on. She thought of Grant beside her, and of the journey still ahead. Tomorrow they would board planes again. Meetings would resume. London awaited. But tonight, beneath the hum of music and the steady beat of the sea, they had made a promise not of ease, but of endurance, not of spectacle, but of trust. The heart of the Sea Fund had begun. Human First Hospitality was no longer an idea, but a movement. And Claire knew this was only the opening chapter of a story still being written. The waves kept rising and falling, as they always would, and she, at last, was ready to rise and fall with them. Life often teaches us that success is not measured only by titles, wealth, or numbers on a page. True success lies in the courage to hold on to our humanity, even when the world pushes us toward cold efficiency. Claire's journey reminds us that dignity can be found in the smallest choices, offering warmth to a stranger, standing firm in our values, or daring to believe we belong in places that once seemed unreachable. For those of us who have weathered decades of storms, her story feels familiar. We know the weight of bills, the ache of loss, the walls built around wounded hearts, and yet, we also know the power of compassion, the way one act of kindness can ripple farther than we imagine. Grant's change shows that even the strongest walls can crack when touched by honesty and care. No matter how far grief or pride may carry us, it is never too late to choose differently, to see people instead of problems. Perhaps that is the promise worth keeping, to live not only for what we can gain, but for what we can give. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your precious time with us and walking through this story together. If Claire and Grant's journey touched your heart, Please show your support, like this video. Share it with someone who might need its message, and don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories. Your encouragement helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Until next time, may kindness and hope always guide your days.